To Washington Watch. Always great to see you.
Tony, it's great to be with you. And my grandma's name was Esther. So this Bible verse, for such a time as this, means so much to me, and certainly has been a theme when we were deciding to run for Congress or not, that for such a time as this, you and I, your listeners, we've been called to stand up and be accountable.
Well, certainly you've responded to that call, leaving the medical practice as a doctor, having delivered over 5,000 babies, having a profession in which you were embraced by your patients, now in Congress dealing with some very frustrating issues, one of those being government spending. You have been outspoken in your opposition to this spending deal. Why?
Well, Tony, I think you kind of set this up. Pre-COVID, we were spending about $4.5 trillion per year, and now we're at $6.5 trillion per year. So they want to make this the new baseline. At the end of the day, this country is $31 trillion in debt. $31 trillion in debt. We're spending $600 billion a year in interest alone. This is unsustainable. This is the greatest threat to our country's national security, to the future of my grandchildren, to schools, to roads and bridges. This is just something that we cannot keep kicking down the road. This is a time for us to stand up. I want to point out, I don't blame Speaker McCarthy. I think he negotiated the best he could. Remember, America gave him one of three levers when it comes to the appropriation process. Americans gave us President Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer to lead the Senate. And they govern like they're part of this European Green Socialist Party. They don't govern like they're moderates. So I hope America remembers this come the next election. Kevin did the best job he could, but I'm not satisfied. I cannot put my name on this legislation.
You know, you were in the House before you came over to the Senate, and they're coming out of the Speaker's election in January. We saw unprecedented unity in the Republican conference up to this point. I mean, we've seen a lot of good things happen in the House, and you know how many fractures in the unity that we saw. I'll get that out here in a moment. During your time in the House, is this putting at risk we saw this even in the Senate. The Senate Republicans came together behind the negotiations to try to get a conservative deal negotiated. Does this put Republican unity at risk?
Well, Tony, I think that's a great question. We're a family, just like your family, our families have disputes as well. We'll have disputes, but at the end of the day, we still love each other. We know that for the good of the team, we've got to come back together. So we can disagree on this. Again, I think we're just between a rock and a hard place here. I think Kevin negotiated the best he could in good faith, but I blame the people of Pennsylvania, the people of Georgia and Arizona and Nevada that they didn't give us a Senate Republican majority. I blame the people who elected for the current president as well. So I understand your point. We'll come together when this is over, but we're going to have a disagreement, and it's going to be pretty loud here for a couple of days.
Well, I do hope that unity can be preserved, but I want to go on to some of the specifics that you've been pointing to about where our money has been going to. I mean, you did a deep dive into the COVID, the coronavirus, and where it came from, tracking it back to the Chinese lab. We're sending money to these people who are working, I mean, not only to China, but to Russia, countries that are working in many ways to oppose and even undermine America.
Right, Tony, it makes no sense. You fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me that we would allow this to continue. So I think that the preponderance of evidence shows that the COVID virus was made and released accidentally from a lab in Wuhan, China, funded with American tax dollars in that research. And we're still funding that Wuhan lab. Appreciate Senator Ernst and Congressman Gallagher for pointing out they've discovered a total of $1.3 billion that have been sent to Russia and China to do similar type of research as well. Couldn't be more frustrating. There's better things to do with this money. This would be the equivalent of funding Iran with nuclear research, saying that, oh, we're going to do nuclear power research, but in reality, we know they're going to end up with nuclear bombs as well. So the story continues. You can't make this stuff up.
Given the fact that we now have a new baseline of federal spending, an additional $2 trillion, and I know we get lost in all of these zeros, that's a lot of money. We go back to, $4.5 trillion prior to COVID, now to 6.3. That's a lot of money, and it's funding a lot of these programs. It's funding a lot of woke policies. I mean, look at what it's done to our military. You've been very outspoken about that. Is any of that being clawed back, reining in the liberal agenda of the Biden administration?
Well, Tony, unfortunately, no. All this legislation does is slow down the increase. So the increase wouldn't be as big as what Joe Biden would want it. So he wanted current levels plus something. This slows it down a little bit, but I think it's insignificant as far as a slowdown. And you're right. Again, this is the president that's governing like he's part of this woke green socialist party. Science be darned. They're going to do it their way. They're going to have energy that's expensive, that's not affordable, that it's not reliable, let alone these woke policies. I'll be on the floor here in a second with Coach Tuberville fighting the Department of Defense and their abortion policies as well. And kudos to Coach Tuberville for leading this fight.
You're absolutely right, and thank you for backing him. Of course, I know you're one of the strongest pro-life voices in the Senate, but that's another example of where the Department of Defense is taking our tax dollars and going from what was about 20 abortions a year in our military to projecting of 4,000. That's tax dollars that's supporting that.
Right. It's tax dollars. And by the way, it's against the law. The Hyde Amendment is something you and I have been fighting for to protect for probably a decade now. The years go by quickly. So we think this is a violation of the Hyde Amendment. It would use taxpayer funds to fund abortions for our military. You know, what's interesting to me is the Department of Defense picked this fight. They didn't have to pick the fight, but they took a law that said this is not possible, that it's unlawful, and used a rule to trump that, if you will. So it's pretty frustrating. We have a White House that ignores laws and just wants to make up his own.
Does it not show you how committed this administration is to the leftist agenda of abortion, of radical human sexuality, redefining human beings? I mean, that's what they're committed to, and they're not afraid to push the envelope to accomplish their agenda.
Right, Tony, and I wish you were understating it, but you're not. I think you go back to why do we have 10,000 people being apprehended at the border every day? It's because Joe Biden wants that. He wants people watching that problem. Meanwhile, he's attacking our civil liberties, our religious rights as well. It couldn't be more frustrating up here for me to watch this. As we did a memorial ceremony yesterday, or 2 days ago rather, at Fort Riley, standing over the graves of 4,700 soldiers from the big Red One division, just that they died for our liberties. And here we have a president that wants to take away those civil liberties with a disregard for the constitutions and the law of the land.
Well, we appreciate you fighting the good fight and raising these issues and fighting them on the Senate floor and elsewhere. Senator Roger Marshall, always great to see you. Thanks so much